Hello, everyone. My name is Julie Rupert. I'm the marketing manager for the high school science line at Pearson. We are so excited to have you join us today for our at-home learning webinar, Biosphere II, What Makes a Scientific Failure, with Obi Martin. Obi is a national science specialist for Pearson. As a former science teacher, his enthusiasm for hands-on activities and finding the most unusual phenomena has allowed him to take his success in the classroom on the road to K-12 science educators. Obi is featured in educational videos for our best-selling science titles and also conducts trainings, presentations, and workshops across the country. Before we get started, I have a few housekeeping items for you. All of your lines are muted. If you have questions, please chat them in the question box. I will try and answer all of those that I can about logistics, but if you have any questions for Obi about the presentation, just type them in there and I will read them out loud for you at the end during Q&A. You'll also notice on the side of your screen there is a handouts box. This has a certificate of participation if you need one, along with several activities and documents that Obi will reference during his presentation. You can download them now or you can download them later from our blog. Speaking of the blog, we will post a recording of this webinar in case you want to rewatch it or if you'd like to share it. As soon as I'm done talking, I will post the link to the blog in the chat box on the side of your screen. And we hope to have this recording posted by the end of the week. If you'd like to sign up for more biology, chemistry, or physics webinars, keep an eye on our blog or follow us on social media, Pearson Pre-K-12, on Twitter, Facebook, or LinkedIn. And with all that out of the way, now I will turn it over to Obi. Thank you.
Thank you, Julie, and thank you for writing my biography for me. I appreciate that. This is Biosphere II, What Makes a Scientific Failure. My name is Obi Martin, as I'm the National Science Specialist, and what we wanted to do was really kind of highlight some weird science phenomena, and this is one of the ways we're going to do it. Now, why am I talking about Biosphere 2 on this webinar? Well, a few different reasons. Number one, it's a phenomena, an interesting story that helps us understand Biosphere 1. And by Biosphere 1, of course, I mean the Earth we live on. Number two, it helps us understand how science works. It's called Biosphere 2, what makes a scientific failure. Now, that's not a definitive answer, and we're going to talk about that as we move throughout. But science isn't about making a plan, developing a hypothesis, and everything going perfectly, right? Science is about trying new things, developing a hypothesis, and kind of adapting as we go and taking those lessons as they come. And this is a great example of that. And finally, it's a really interesting story. The more I dove into it, the more interesting it became. And our Miller and Levine biology program features a case study at every chapter, and this has always been one of my favorites. It doesn't get all the play of genetics or some of the crazier kind of subjects that are out there, the more cutting edge. But this Biosphere 2 story it's an interesting phenomena to build into a deeper understanding, and that's what we're going to take a look at today. Now, if you are here for Ken and Joe's earlier webinars, I am neither Ken Miller nor Joe Levine. I was a classroom teacher, middle school and in fifth grade, and I had planned on running this webinar kind of how I ran my classroom, which means I'm not going to lecture at you for an hour. I don't have an hour's worth of material, and no one wants to hear me talk, not even my own children, for an hour long. So I'm going to run this as I would if I was actually in a classroom. When I was in the classroom, I believed in something called problem-based learning, where I would introduce my students to a phenomena. I would fill in some details, get them talking, get them thinking, give them some information, and then present resources to them that they could then use to come to their own conclusions. So instead of this being an hour-long lecture for students or even for teachers, this is meant to be kind of like a little lesson in a capsule, right? Where we introduce a topic, students can then do self-directed kind of study with assorted resources and of course the internet, and then we're going to direct them to actually solve a problem or make a decision on their own. And we'll see how that goes as we move throughout. So the agenda for today is we're going to start with what was Biosphere 2, right? If no one's ever heard of it, we're going to give you some great background on that. We're going to give students a task Was it a success? And that is not a cut and dried answer. If there was one right or wrong answer, I would not be using it for problem-based learning. We want people to come to their own conclusions based on kind of different sources of evidence, and we'll look at that as we go throughout. Then we'll introduce the learning resources, and a lot of them are in that handout section that Julie talked about over to the side, and we'll leave some time at the end for questions and answers if need be. Okay, so first, we need to go back in time, all the way back to 1981. Just if you are on the call and you were not born in 1981, I want to give you a little background information about what the world was like, okay? So Ronald Reagan was the president. In the world of technology, IBM put out their first personal computer running MS-DOS. In the world of science, scientists had just identified the HIV virus. So that actually happened in 1981. In the world of pop culture, Indiana Jones and Raiders of the Lost Ark was the top movie of 1981. Hopefully you've all seen that. And probably the most important thing to come out of 1981, Britney Spears and Justin Timberlake were both born. Also my wife. So, good year, 1981. That is when all of this started. Now, where it started was in Oracle, Arizona. It's about 30 miles north of Tucson, kind of out in the desert. For those of you who are not from that area, or maybe you're not strong geography students, right? Here's the United States map. I am in Indianapolis, up in Indiana, kind of that area right up there right now. Tucson is kind of right down near the Mexican border. So this is where they decided to create this Biosphere II. So what is it? Well, it was Earth Systems Research Facility. So basically they attempted to create a balanced and self-sustaining replica of the Earth's ecosystems. So there were 5 different ecosystems that they were dealing with, that they were building in an enclosed area. And we'll talk about kind of the tail of the tape here a little bit later. And it's the largest closed system ever created. Now, they built this in order to really see how these ecosystems kind of went through their systems and how these ecosystems kind of reacted, and how we can use these ecosystems to learn about Biosphere 1. The mission statement of Biosphere 2 was all about education. They wanted to learn about the Earth's ecosystems. And one of the ways they do that is by kind of observing them. And if you do it in science, if we do it within an enclosed space, we can kind of handle all the different variables that go into that. So if I go out into the desert, right, in Arizona, there are lots of different variables there that I can't really account for. If I put the desert inside of an enclosed space, right, I can control the temperature, I can control the precipitation, I can control what species are there. It's a great way to learn about the ecosystems and how the different kind of species and factors that ecosystem interact. They were practicing different ecotechnology, right? What can we do? And this is still going on today. What can we do to help ecosystems? When we look at, we're gonna look at ocean acidification or drought, right? What can we do to limit the impacts of some of those things that are happening out in the real world? Well, we can practice those in an enclosed space where, failure isn't such a big deal. And it was a simulation. We wanted to see if we could take the Earth systems, put them in miniature, and then use those to survive in a self-sustaining ecosystem. One of the things that really made this a big news story was that simulation kind of part of it, because people grabbed that and really ran with it. Not necessarily the scientists involved, but the media. Because if we could build a self-sustaining kind of Earth ecosystems enclosed, that means we could probably colonize the moon, or especially Mars, or any other planet that we might come across. So that was really what caught the public's attention. Can we take this ecosystem? Can it be self-sustaining? Can we put the Earth in miniature? Have scientists move inside, right, and be able to survive no matter what's going on outside? So that's really what got people involved. To make matters even more exciting, the company who financed Biosphere 2 was called Space Biosphere Ventures, right? Which really made people think, okay, this is something that we're going to do in order to start colonizing space. If this is successful, next stop is Mars. So, tail of the tape. Biosphere 2 was approximately 3.14 acres, which is really cool because, it's also pie. There was a 20,000 square foot rainforest built into Biosphere 2. There was a 9,100 square foot ocean. It was 25 feet deep. It had a coral reef ecosystem kind of built in, right? And we'll kind of talk a little bit about how they had to, instead of like having a self-sustained ecosystem, how they actually took kind of the algae off. They had to clean it. They had to purify the water. They also had to use vacuum pumps to simulate ocean waves, right, in order to make it kind of a healthy coral ecosystem. So there was some man-made work built into that. But it's 25 feet deep, 9,100 square feet. Coral reef ecosystem was built in, had tons of tropical fish. The scientists who were locked in for this simulation, which we'll talk about, always talked about how fun it was to snorkel around the coral reef down there. There was a 4,800 square foot mangrove wetlands ecosystem meant to kind of mimic the Florida Everglades, kind of the swampland around the Gulf Coast. There was a 14,000 square foot desert or savanna grassland. The desert was 15,000 square feet. Interesting story about the desert. It started off with mostly kind of cacti and succulents. And then because of the glass dome, the condensation that built up on the glass kind of changed the ecosystem. And they let it happen. It became more shrubs and trees kind of growing in the desert than the cactus and the succulents. There was a 27,000 square foot agricultural center. In order to be self-sufficient, the scientists had to grow their own food. So, they had 80 different types of crops, which we'll kind of talk about when we talk about their diets as they went in. Really wanted them to be able to live off the land, so to speak. And we'll talk about that a little bit later on. And then, of course, there was the living quarters. Now, keep in mind, this was back in 1991. They built it in 81, but the actual simulation we'll see was later on. So this is the finest technology from kind of 1991 on. They had personal computers, they had stereos, kind of luxury apartments built in. Although, as we'll see, they didn't get a lot of time to rest while they were in the Biosphere 2. Okay, so the actual experiment had 8 scientists, 4 men, 4 women. They're all wearing snazzy red jumpsuits, of course, because that's the way things were back in the 1990s. And the goal was to send 8 people into this Biosphere 2 for 2 years, from 1991 to 1993. Now, the ultimate goal was to show self-sufficiency. Remember, we wanted to create a balanced and self-sustaining replica of the Earth's ecosystem, which means that everything that they had in there had to come from in there. We wanted to kind of replicate what would happen if we kind of took this to Mars or what have you. And so the plan was just to lock these people in for 2 years and see what happened, which is great when you're talking about experimenting on actual people. Some foresight that went into this. They put 3,800 different species. They call it species packing, right? Where they knew all 3,800 of the species were not going to survive. So they made sure that they put in enough species that if we did have some kind of go extinct in our ecosystem, there would be kind of backup species built in. So they call that species packing, 3,800 different species. The diet was extremely interesting because remember, they had to grow their entire kind of diet in the agricultural system. So they grew about 80 different crops. They used a diet kind of developed back in the 80s in UCLA. It was a very low calorie, nutrient rich diet. So they started at 1,800 calories a day. As they became better farmers and the agricultural system kind of over the several months became more prolific, they got that up to about 2,200 calories a day. They found that most of the scientists lost about 16% of their body weight. As you can imagine, eating only vegetables. I mean, I probably had 2,200 calories so far already today, and I have not had dinner yet. It's one of those kind of quarantine diets where you just snack on things all day, and we still have Easter candy. One of the things that I found really interesting about their diet was they only got a half pound of meat a week. Um, so they would slaughter their own kind of livestock as they were in there. So they got about half pound of meat a week. All the milk and eggs that they got was very rare. They got it from their kind of milk cow and their chickens that they had. Coffee, which is, vital for my own way of life. They had coffee about every 2 to 3 weeks because they had to grow their own coffee beans in the rainforest ecosystem. So, really, these scientists made a sacrifice to be in there. They did get to eat fish as well. So, mostly vegetables grown in their agricultural site. Again, 80 different crops. They got about half pound of meat a week. Think about a quarter pounder, right? That's 2 quarter pounder patties a week. And then they also raise their own tilapia and rice patties in the kind of ocean ecosystem. Now, another kind of bit of foresight that they had was the values and the mission. And this is going to be something that comes into play when we talk about some of the challenges that went into Biosphere 2. But they went in as scientists, and the ultimate goal was to see how these ecosystems played out, right? They wanted them to be self-sustaining, but as the case where the condensation built up on the glass in the desert ecosystem, one of the scientists said, you know what, we got to let the ecosystem do what the ecosystem does, and we're just here to observe, right? They wanted to really just kind of catalog what happens in these ecosystems and then eventually use what they've learned to affect the outside world. Now, that changed a little bit as they went through, but that was the value or the mission that they went in with was, all right, we're going to use this to kind of research the Earth's ecosystems, but also to educate other people out there. Another thing that they really kind of made their mission was as little outside interference as possible. And this is kind of what they spent their time doing. We talked about the plush kind of apartments that they had. They didn't get to spend a lot of time there. They spent about 25% of their time farming, right? 20% was actually in the research area where they were actually doing that research in the ecosystems and charting what was going on with the different species and with the different plant. One of the things that happened very quickly was the biomass, the total mass of plants in the ecosystem doubled very quickly. The algae built up on the kind of coral ecosystem in the ocean ecosystem very quickly, and they had to account for that. So, that type of research led into that 11% over there with the management. And that management means they had to go in and kind of by hand kind of tweak their different ecosystems, kind of make sure that everything was going according to plan and kind of tend the garden of the ecosystems, if you were. 19% was writing, 12% was cooking, and then 13% was miscellaneous or media. Now, they were locked in there for 2 years. However, there were windows, so they could visit by telephone. Keep in mind, there were no kind of internet connections back there. There was definitely no iPhones, which means there was no FaceTime. There's really no way to see each other now. I think when we think about being stuck in our homes now, with all the technology we have, whether it be Netflix or tablets or cell phones or what have you, being stuck in a biosphere in 1991 to 1993 was a completely different experience. But they did do a lot of media. Again, this really caught the attention of the masses, probably because there wasn't as much going on in 1991 to 1993 than there is now. Again, no internet. So, it was in all the news. It was on all the news stories, it was in all the newspapers, and people were really excited at first to see what was going on. And of course, they kind of kept a record as they went throughout. And then close to 1 billion people watched as they kind of unsealed it, kind of around the world. So some of the challenges that they had, one of the biggest and first challenges that they came across was the oxygen levels. Now, we all know human beings need certain things to survive, right? We need food, we need shelter, we have to breathe. The oxygen levels dipped over the first few months, really because of a few factors that they didn't even know about until they did some studies kind of years after the biosphere experiment was over. So the Biosphere 2 soil was really, really rich in organic material, especially in the rainforest and in the savanna. So the microbes that were metabolizing this kind of material in this really rich soil were doing it at a really, really high rate, much higher rate than happens in the outside world, and much higher rate than everyone thought about as they were, planning this experiment than they had, planned on, which was releasing a lot of excess carbon dioxide into the atmosphere and using up a lot of oxygen. So that's one thing. However, I talked about the biomass doubling when they first heard about this. Well, they thought the plant life that was kind of thriving in the Biosphere 2 environment should have been kind of taking all that CO2 and then kind of spitting out oxygen. That should have kind of balanced itself out. And they kind of thought it would at first. So it dropped from 20% down to kind of 18% and then 16%. And they're like, all right, it's going to bounce back. And they actually decided not to interfere, not to intervene, and allow it to kind of take place just to see what would actually happen. Again, kind of using themselves as guinea pigs. Then it got down to 14%, and they really started to see the effects of kind of oxygen deprivation on all of the scientists that were inside. So these scientists started to be very lethargic. They would get headaches. They said they're watching on the live feeds of them farming, they would look like they were working in slow motion. So they were really feeling the effects to the point where their health was being kind of imperiled by these low oxygen levels. And that's when they decided to actually pump oxygen in. Now, when they decided to do that, a lot of the media and people outside were, well, the experiment's a failure. You guys didn't do what you set out to do, which was create a balanced and self-sustaining ecosystem. If you're pumping in oxygen, then it's not self-sustaining. You're getting help from the outside world. But they decided to continue the experiment after that because, as we'll see, there was kind of a split in the mission and the values that went forward. But they did decide to continue for the entire 2 years, even though after 16 months, they had to pump oxygen in. Another challenge was with the species. As I said, there were, tons of different species that were kind of put in there. 3 especially really, really thrived, and 2 of them were not supposed to. One was morning glories in the rainforest. They really threatened to choke out every other piece of plant life in the rainforest ecosystem, to the point where, I mean, just the environment they're in, they just thrived so well. The scientists that were kind of within the experiment, those 8, had spent hours and hours and hours kind of plucking them to keep them from choking out kind of all of the other plant life in the rainforest ecosystem. However, the morning glories were actually supposed to be there. These other 2 were not. So one was the common household cockroach. They did import 3 other types of cockroaches. They brought those in willingly to help with kind of decomposition. They were there for a reason. But there was a stowaway, which was the human cockroach. And as we know about cockroaches, they thrive in just about every environment, and they really, 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 did well in the biosphere ecosystems. And they came to be quite a problem, as cockroaches tend to do. Another one was what they call the crazy ant. Was not supposed to be there, an invasive species. It snuck in. As a matter of fact, several years after the experiment, before the University of Arizona actually bought the Biosphere system and turned it into kind of a research / museum / conference center, they said there were so many crazy ants that you couldn't see the surface of some of the areas. Another problem they had with species was most of them died out. I think roughly like 80 some odd % of the vertebrate animals died within the 2 years, and most of them pretty quick. And all of the pollinating insects went extinct within the first year and a half. So this ecosystem really struggled to support the kind of animal life that it needed to, but it did really support the ones that it didn't. And then, of course, the challenge when you lock 8 people into a 3-acre compound for 2 years, there's going to be some conflict, right? Uh, One of the things that we found was the conflict was based mostly on the mission, and we kind of alluded to this several times, where half of the people, and they actually interestingly split 4 on 4. 4 scientists were in one group, 4 scientists were in the other. Um, Half of them just want to do the scientific research. They thought the education and what they were going to learn from the scientific resource was so important that everything should continue on. The other half kind of bought into the, you know what, this is a simulation where we shouldn't, we're trying to create a self-sustaining ecosystem. The, importance of that trumps everything else. So there were 2 groups, and apparently it got to the point where they had to do their own homegrown group therapy sessions. They had to read books on conflict management. There were, literally not speaking to each other, and they would not look each other in the eye when they passed each other in the biodome. However, they were all scientists who believed in the mission, so it did not affect any of the kind of processes and research. When it came time to work, they still managed to work together. So by and large, the scientific community considered the Biosphere II a success because they learned a lot from it, and we'll talk about a couple of those things here in a second. But the kind of media labeled it, and I quote, a miserable and expensive failure because it cost approximately 150 million, which is like 280 some odd $1 million in our day. And it's really a cause for controversy still. Like, people still debate it. But however, it didn't stop them from trying again. And attempt number 2, I really encourage you to look up in your own time because it's magnificent. It lasted from March to September of 1994. Yeah, they wanted to go 2 years. It went from March to September of 1994. One of the reasons, because Space Biosphere Ventures dissolved in June, right? There were stories of sabotage. Federal marshals were called in because some of the original scientists from the first experiment like kind of broke in to help the second scientist. And Steve Bannon, former advisor to the president, was heavily involved. So if you want to look up a really weird story that doesn't really have anything to do with the science, go ahead and look up attempt number 2 of the biosphere, and that's fun to do. The results. The results kind of speak for themselves. Now, if you look at this, and this is where I guess the question comes in. If you look at this as, can we build a completely balanced and self-sustaining replica of the Earth's ecosystems? Like, we plan Biosphere 2 as, can we colonize Mars, tomorrow and take that up there? Then yeah, it was considered a scientific failure. That's kind of what the media reported. But Biosphere 2 is still going, as we'll see. I mean, it's still there in Arizona. Obviously, you can't go now because you can't go anywhere now. But eventually, when everything opens back up, you'll be able to go to Biosphere 2, and you'll get to see all the different research they've done. They've done some amazing things with ocean acidification. They've done some great things with drought studies in the rainforest, and you can see all the research on the website that we'll take a look at here in a second. It's still there. And what it does is it allows you to take the ecosystems of the Earth and control the variables within, which allows scientists to observe and learn some pretty amazing things. So some people say, yes, it is a failure because it didn't set out for the mission that, we thought it was going to set out for. And then, of course, others consider it a success because of what has come from that failure. The biosphere today is owned by the University of Arizona. It is still in the same place. Obviously, they're not going to move it because it's like a 3-acre compound. But you eventually can go back there again. You can visit, you can take field trips. There's conference centers. If you go to biosphere2.org, you will get all sorts of videos. You can get live feeds, and you can see kind of the research and the activity that's going on in the biosphere right now. Actually, it's kind of kicked back up into popular culture at Sundance this past year. One of the grand jury prize finalists was a movie called Spaceship Earth. So this headline here, Spaceship Earth uncovers the goodness hidden in the debacle of Biosphere 2. It's going to be a documentary. It's actually bought by the same production company that put out Parasite, the Oscar winner from last year. So that will be coming supposedly this summer. As we know, kind of everything's kind of up in the air about when movies come out. So it may hopefully come to a streaming service. If you can't wait until this summer, I cannot recommend this, but back in 1996, there was a movie called Biodome with Pauly Shore and Stephen Baldwin, one of the lesser famous Baldwin brothers. It was a comedy. It was a satire on the whole Biosphere II debacle, in which two kind of losers, I guess, for lack of a better term, end up caught in the biodome during that experiment for 2 years. Horrible, horrible movie. But if you're a student, you just may enjoy it. Okay, so your task, we kind of reviewed Biosphere 2. We're obviously not giving you all the information on Biosphere 2. We're just going to give you a taste of Biosphere 2, get you interested in the story. So the task is really 3 questions. Number 1, Biosphere 2 was intended to be a small-scale model of Biosphere 1. From your research, discuss the limitations of this model. So yes, we're going to expect you to do some research and learn about how this model was limited, especially as it was designed in the first place. Number 2, imagine you're an engineer designing an artificial biosphere. What approach would you use? How could your design attempt avoid the problems faced by Biosphere 2? So, all right, you think you could do better? Now give it a shot. Number 3, and this is really the main question of this whole kind of series, in your educated opinion, was Biosphere 2 a failure, a success, or both? Right? So those are the questions. That's the actual task. And you'll find those in your handouts under the case studies section. The resources in your handouts, there's a foundations reading and study guide. This is going to give you kind of disciplinary core ideas, the background information about the Earth systems. And you're going to need that in order to, I guess, talk about some of these things. If you're going to cite evidence, you really need to know about the concepts that you're talking about. And that's where you get the concepts. There's a lab. One's called an In Your Neighborhood lab. It's open-ended inquiry. It really is more of a STEM lab where we want you as students to go out in your own ecosystem, your own area, and kind of plan your own garden, which means you have to look at soil composition, you have to look at precipitation, you have to look at the weather, you have to look at the sunlight at different times of the day. You have to kind of research plants that thrive in your particular ecosystem. So you're going to act just like the people did when they were building the Biosphere 2. This is the way to just kind of practice the skills and learn about abiotic factors and plant selection. There's a data analysis lab. Again, if you're going to do this type of work, you have to know how to analyze data. So this is a great way to kind of study biomes, but do it in a way that has you practicing kind of applying scientific reasoning and constructing your own graphs. And finally, the biggest resource you have is the internet. In that handout link, there is a Word doc with a bunch of links that I found. I mean, there's a TED Talk from one of the scientists who was locked in Biosphere 2 for 2 years. It was really interesting, fantastic. There's a couple kind of short YouTube videos. There's some articles there. There's a ton of information about Biosphere 2 available on the internet, and it's really great, especially with a question like this, because some of it is very anti-Biosphere 2 and talking about what a failure it was, and some of it, really extols the virtues of it and talks about some of the science that took place and some of the wins that happened because of this experiment. So that's a great resource as well. And then there's an extension activity that's built in there. We have a partnership with the Howard Hughes Medical Institute with Mill Levine Biology, and they created enrichment activities. And this is the actual enrichment activity from this case study, where it's a video series about a biologist in Gorongosa. So not only is there a video there that can be downloaded in HD or standard definition, there's also a student guide. So if you're a teacher and you want to assign that, you can do that. And then there's some kind of science practice activities that are built in to go with that as well. So the first part of that, the lab, the foundations guide, the data analysis, and the internet research, that's all to answer those questions. This HHMI video would be a great extension activity or an additional activity if you are still studying kind of the Earth systems and how we study that. So what makes a failure? And that's the question we want everybody to ask themselves today. If you are a student, obviously we've given you the resource to do that. Most importantly, if you're a teacher and you would like to assign these questions to your students and give them the resource that we have access to. We're really interested in finding out, what people out there think. We all have our own opinions, and we can all, support that with different data. As we can see on the internet, many people have. But that's the question that we're asking. Biosphere 2, what makes a scientific failure? So we want to thank you all for coming here today. We are going to kind of leave this open for questions for the next few minutes, and then this recording will be available, as Julie said, on our blog, which we'll send out an example of that a little bit later on. Julie?
Yes, and just a reminder, we will post this recording on the blog, hopefully by the end of the week, and we will also post the handouts that Obi referenced. But if you want to get the handouts right now, you can get them in the control panel of this from GoToWebinar. It's right below questions, above chat. You'll see handouts, and there's 5 of them, and that includes the 2 labs, the webinar links document, the case study, and then also a certificate of attendance, just in case you need that for whatever reason. So all those are there for you to download. And we did put in the chat the blog link if you need that directly. Also, after this webinar is over, you'll get an automatic email with a survey. It also has my email address in it. So if you have any questions afterwards, you can reach out to me. But if anybody right now has any questions in the chat that they want to ask, please go right ahead. And the first one we have is, what is Biosphere 1?
That's the Earth.
That's the Earth we live on. Is there a list of plants currently being raised in Biosphere 2?
Yes, if you go to biosphere2.org, they have all of their current initiatives and what they're working on, as well as a list of what has happened there since ownership has changed over.
Okay, and do the low oxygen levels mean that your biosphere needs more plants that produce oxygen in order to achieve balance?
Actually, what they found, I'm sorry I forgot this part, because of the biomass, they thought that would account for it, and they kind of skipped on to something else. Another thing that they found was the concrete that they used to build the biosphere, right? It was kind of taking the excess carbon dioxide that was in the air, and it was reacting with the calcium hydroxide that was in the concrete to form calcium carbonate and water. So when they tested the walls much later on, there was like 10 times the amount of calcium carbonate on the inner surface of the walls than the outer surface of the walls. So, it was kind of taking that carbon dioxide that would have been kind of processed by the plants and kind of reacting with the walls. So what they had to do was they had to put a coating on the inside of the walls to keep the carbon dioxide from reacting with the concrete.
Okay, here is another one, and this actually, Obi, you did say it in your conclusion, so maybe just repeat it again, but the question was, what exactly made Biosphere 2 a failure?
The idea was, when they went in, is they wanted to create a self-sustaining replica of the Earth's ecosystem. In order to be self-sustaining, they could not have any kind of outside help, right? And when they pumped oxygen in, many considered that to be a failure of the original mission, which was to be self-sufficient. When you have to take, I guess, resources from the outside and bring them in, that kind of ruins that part of it.
Okay.
Also, the widespread extinction. So that, didn't really help things either. It wasn't supporting the species that it needed to support.
What was the most unexpected thing that scientists learned from Biosphere 2?
It was the oxygen levels. That was like the biggest surprise for them. They did not account for that when they kind of went in for the second go round. They'd installed some CO2 scrubbers that they went through. So that was the biggest thing. Probably the biggest benefit that came out of it was their understanding of how to take care of the coral ecosystem, the coral reef ecosystem in the ocean. By really having such a small ecosystem that was there to replicate the ocean ecosystem, they were allowed to try a lot of new things that have helped with kind of maintaining coral ecosystems throughout the world.
Okay. I think you just kind of said this, but this is a different question. It's what were all of the successes if it needed oxygen and it was not self-sufficient?
Well, it was the other side of the equation, which was, can we create kind of pocket ecosystems where we can control the different variables and use them for research? So that wasn't apparent right away because everyone looked at the simulation as, can we survive for 2 years self-sufficiently? But as we kind of left that experiment, we still have these pocket ecosystems that they can, scientists can come in and run their own studies on. So that was the big win from Biosphere 2, which is still going on today.
You said that attempt 2 lasted from March to September. Did attempt 1 last the whole 2 years?
Yep, the attempt 1 with the whole 2 years. As I said, after 16 months, they had to pump in oxygen, but they did continue for the full 2 years. The
And
attempt
that
did not end because of like science or health concerns. It was more of like controversy and money.
that's attempt 2, right?
Yeah.
Yes. All right. Did the media talk about the good things that came out of Biosphere 2 during that time?
Yes, the scientific media did, but the, I guess, mainstream media, I hate to use that term, but the mainstream media was more about the kind of internal conflicts that were going on and the kind of basically the problems that they were having with the ecosystem. That's what gets you, I can't say the clicks because there were no internet, but that's what gets you the views for your television program is conflict that goes on and problems, not, hey, we're still being successful over here.
If the goal was to simulate environments, why was it necessary for the scientists to seclude themselves instead of simply monitoring the environment alone?
Because part of it was to see if their model ecosystems could support human life.
Okay. Can it be a biosphere if it is, for example, a cube?
Yes. More of a biosphere in theory.
Why did they continue after pumping in oxygen if it was already a failure?
Because of the kind of conflict between the two, is half of them were like, this is all about survival and can we create this? And then the other half were like, no, we're actually here to do research. Just because we pump in oxygen, there were still other things within the ecosystems that they were studying. So they want to end their research just because the self-sustaining portion of those kind of goals kind of went south.
When is Biosphere 3 coming out? That sounds
Biosphere,
like the name of a movie.
Biosphere 3, The Revenge. This time is personal. Probably not. I mean, Biosphere 2 is still there. So it's still kind of pumping along and doing a great job. So I imagine that's going to be there for years to come. I hope to get out there soon. So I hope to leave the house soon.
You and me both. And with that, anybody else has additional questions, feel free to put them in the survey after you finish the presentation today, and we'll try to post an FAQ document up on our blog. We'll also post all of these handouts, but it's probably going to take a day or two to get it up there, so I do encourage you to download them now before you sign off. And thank you all so much for attending today.
And I am going to stop sharing my screen. And you guys, thank you so much and have a fantastic day.